Hi researchers, welcome to our discussion on the conceptual framework. So if you have already reached this point of the discussion and of our online modules, then that must mean that you already have a research topic in mind and that you have already refined the said research topic by breaking it down into research questions and objectives, coming out of course of a critical review of literature. If you haven't done those yet, then I invite you to watch our previous videos in order to guide you to how to come up with a stronger introduction which will outline or highlight the gap in the literature. After having done that, then now is the time for us to talk about the conceptual framework. So what is the conceptual framework? A conceptual framework includes one or more formal theories. So we have to take note of that it is possible for you to use more than one theory. You can marry multiple theories, and these theories can be used either in part or in whole, as well as the other concepts and empirical findings from the literature. So when we talk about conceptual framework, it is not only limited to one theory, and it is not only limited to the theory. This can also incorporate other concepts that you have found in your previous review of related literature. Now, the conceptual framework is intended to show the relationships amongst your ideas and how they eventually spell out into your research study. It therefore translates the theories into their component concepts and then eventually expressed at the variable level. Especially if you're using, for example, a quantitative approach, one common question would be, what are the variables that you have decided to use? And so these variables are actually sourced out from the concepts, which are called out from the theories. So I think at this point, let's stop very quickly and talk about what are theories, what are concepts, and what are variables. How are these three different? Now, the theory is the more abstract of the three. When we talk about a theory, it refers to a set of interrelated constructs. When we say constructs, we refer to concepts, definitions, and propositions. So therefore a theory is the interrelation of concepts, definitions, and propositions. Now these interrelated constructs basically help explain, predict, and control a phenomena. So if you're going to take some keywords for this, it would of course be concepts, definitions, hypotheses, propositions. And we have to remember that the goal of a theory is to explain, to predict, or control a phenomenon. That is why there is a reason for us to make a study, because we wanted to test this theory. Can the theory explain, predict, or control the phenomenon that we have in mind? Now, can you name some popular theories? Perhaps if you're from the field of education, there are a lot of theories in education, similar as well with marketing, psychology, etc. But perhaps one of the most popular theories that we are able to encounter is the Big Bang Theory. I think we all know that the Big Bang Theory attempts to explain how the universe started and how the universe supposedly began from an extremely hot, dense point, right? So that is the beginning of the universe. That is what the Big Bang Theory wanted to explain. And until now, the Big Bang Theory remains a theory. That is why there are still studies and researches done exploring whether the Big Bang Theory has actually explained the start or the beginnings of the universe. Now, for those of us maybe in the accountancy discipline, we are also familiar with the fraud triangle. Now, the fraud triangle was actually established by Cressy somewhere in the year 1953, and it attempts to model the three conditions where it has been seen, or that these conditions were seen to exist when they analyze fraudulent transactions. So these theories attempt to describe, to explain, to predict, and control the phenomenon. So I'm pretty sure when you read through your literature review, you must have encountered some of the theories used by the other scholars or academicians or researchers. Now, please take note that when we talk about the conceptual framework, again, it is not only limited to one theory, and it is not limited only to the theory. You may also craft your conceptual framework coming from the other concepts that you have read in your literature review. So let's go back to the theory and determine what are the characteristics of a theory. So number one, a theory must be abstract. So abstract concepts are independent of a specific time and place. A theory, therefore, should be as general as possible so that you could test the theory. Okay, so that we could do a study on the theory. The second characteristic of a theory is that it must be relevant. Now, you would know that a theory is relevant if, number one, it is falsifiable. It is capable of being proven wrong. And this somehow helps us, maintain our objectivity as researchers, that when we do a study, when we do a research, the idea is eventually to prove the theory wrong because theories must be falsifiable. This is also the reason why previously we mentioned our review of literature must contain recent articles in order to prove that the theory is indeed still falsifiable. There is still room for argument, there is still room for debate. And secondly, the theories must be supported by observation. So we get to see the two characteristics of the theory. It must be abstract and it must be relevant. This is where the play of abstraction and reality comes in. Now, this is actually quite fun if we try to maybe practice or exercise how we appreciate abstraction from reality. Let us start with this. What is this? And I'm pretty sure most of us will say, well, it's a chair. It's an office chair. But if you're going to level it up to the more abstract concept, what do you think will be a more abstract concept to a chair? Perhaps we will say furniture, right? Furniture is a broader concept than a chair. There are so many other furniture other than a chair, but a chair is a part of a furniture. If we're going to even go a level higher, a more abstract concept of a furniture would be property, plant, and equipment, which is a very familiar terminology for us accountancy peeps. So property, plant, and equipment. And if we're going to even go more abstract to that, the more abstract version of property, plant, and equipment would be assets, right? And if you want to go more abstract to that, maybe you can think of, I don't know, resources. So from the chair, we went to furniture, we went to PPE, and then asset. And take it a level higher, you might say resources. Okay, let's have another practice. What about when we talk about salary? What do you think can be an abstract concept of salary? Perhaps you might say income. You may have other sources of income other than your salary, right? So a salary is just one form of income. And if you want to bring it even to a more abstract level, then you might say wealth. There are other sources of wealth, like they say health is wealth, but all income is also part of wealth. So from salary, we went to income, then we went to wealth. What if we talk about this one? You have observed an employee who is always actively involved in the workplace, has perfect attendance, and always comes on time. These are your observations because we said a theory must be supported by observation. So these are your observations. What could that perhaps spell out? And then maybe we'll say, that could be motivation. And on a more abstract level, we can even go a level higher and say that's employee engagement. So notice that when we talk about theories, the theories are the most abstract. The theories referred to in our illustration, asset, wealth, employee engagement, theories that exist within that level. If you break down the theories, then you get to see the concepts. And when you break down the concepts further, then you get to see the variables. So notice again that the theories are the more abstract. So at an abstract level, for example, you talk about a salesperson's job performance at the empirical testable level, that which is supported by observations. At the observation level, how would you measure salesperson's job performance? Then you might say, well, the number of sales calls, the number of sales, and the dollar or peso value of sales. So we get to see here the interaction between abstraction and reality. The more abstract, which is the theory, and then the more observable, the empirical, which we could use to represent reality. Another famous theory, perhaps that we have all heard about, is Darwin's theory of evolution. So Darwin's theory of evolution is the widely held notion that all life is related and has descended from a common ancestor. Darwin's general theory presumes the development of life from non-life and stresses a purely naturalistic, undirected descent with modification. So I think most of us have heard about Darwin's theory of evolution, so hopefully this is something that we can appreciate together. In Darwin's theory of evolution, it has been quoted so many times that it is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. So this is by Charles Darwin. Now, if we are going to look at this theory, we should be able to identify at least two abstract concepts in the theory of evolution. So going back to the theory of evolution, it is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. We are able to identify two abstract concepts. Number one is, of course, survival, and number two is adaptation. So that's at the theory part. Later, when we go to breaking it down into concepts and variables, then we get to ask the question, how would you measure survival? How would you measure adaptation? Because we wanted to bring the abstract to the reality, from the abstract to the observation, from the abstract to the measurable variables. Okay, so that's for the theory. Now let's talk about propositions, variables, and hypotheses. I know you must have heard about hypotheses so many times now. So let's start by talking about propositions. Propositions are statements explaining the logical linkage among certain concepts by asserting a universal connection between the concepts. A hypothesis, on the other hand, is a statement explaining some outcome. When you talk about a hypothesis, it is empirically testable. Okay, it can be tested. Variables are the empirical assessment of a concept. Anything that may assume that different numerical values are called variables. So we get to notice how detailed, how much more observable this discussion has become. So we have theories, to the theories we have propositions. The propositions will be broken down into hypotheses and eventually will be measured through variables. Let's try to illustrate this one so that we can appreciate it better. Okay, for example, if this is the proposition, the greater the human capital investment, the greater the life chances. And actually, this one we got from the theory of Darwin. Remember the abstract concepts of survival and adaptability. No, so the greater the human capital investment, that's the adaptability side, the greater the life chances, that's the survival side. So from that theory, from those abstract concepts in the theory, we came up with a proposition. And to the proposition, we will come up with more empirically testable hypotheses. What are examples of these hypotheses? For example, hypothesis 1, the greater the formal education, the greater the income. Hypothesis 2, the greater the job experience, the greater the likelihood of promotion. Hypothesis 3, the greater the communication skills, the greater the job performance. Have you noticed how we transitioned from the very abstract theory? We called out two abstract concepts from the theory. From those concepts, we tailored it to our study and came up with a proposition. And from this proposition, you could actually come up with different hypotheses. Now, the when we say the greater the formal education here represents human capital investment. The greater the income here represents life chances. In hypothesis 2, when we talk about job experience represents human capital investment. Promotion represents life chances. Communication skills in hypothesis 3 represents the human capital investment part, and the job performance represents life chances. So we get to convert our abstract theory to proposition, from the less abstract but still abstract proposition to the hypotheses. Okay, now let's put the focus on formal education, income, job experience, promotion, communication skills, and job performance, because one of the things that would be asked of you during your proposal hearing is, how will you measure these variables? So these are already what we call variables. How would you measure them? Now, to measure them, you will come up with their operational definition. Now, when we talk about operational definition, this will describe how each concept will be measured. Let's take the first hypothesis as an example. The first hypothesis says the greater the formal education, the greater the income. How will you measure formal education and income? These are our two variables that we want to empirically test. So perhaps the operational definition of formal education will be years of formal schooling. That means that any education obtained outside formal schooling in your study is not considered, okay, as formal education. So only the years of formal schooling. How is income measured? We know there are many different measures of income, right? But in the case of your study, you might decide that income may be measured through salary range. So therefore, when people read your study, they must be able to understand that when you refer to formal education, you refer to formal schooling. That means you perhaps wouldn't count as formal education those certifications that are obtained outside of a formal university system. When you talk about income, then you only talk about the salary range. You don't include passive income. You don't include income coming from business. Okay, so only the salary range. So the operational definition helps to set the parameters of the variables that you are using. Right? So hopefully you can practice this one in your own research topics. I suppose you already have a research topic. I suppose you have already done a literature review. Now it would be a good thing to do right now if from your RRL you draw out the theories, the concepts, and variables that you believe are relevant to your study. Now remember the research questions that you have constructed. Okay, so from guided by your research question, you can now construct your conceptual framework. Remember again, the conceptual framework will attempt to explain the relationships that you wish to explore in your study. Identify and explain the relationships, okay, among the variables you have chosen. Now, as an option, you may create a diagram to graphically present the relationships among the variables. Remember to label your diagram as figure 1. Now, this is the reason why most panelists would look for your conceptual framework. Okay, they're actually referring, when they say that, they usually refer to your diagram. Now actually a diagram is optional, but a diagram can be a good way for you to illustrate the relationships that you are trying to explore in your study even before going to the theories. It provides kind of like a snapshot version into what you plan to explore in your study. Okay, so it would be a good idea if you can come up with a diagram, if it's appropriate and relevant to your conceptual framework section to have the diagram, then go ahead. But in certain cases, a diagram may not be necessary. Okay, so if you believe that a diagram is not needed, then don't force the issue. Okay, so here are some examples of how your conceptual framework may be explored. So, for example, if you don't wish to use a diagram, then this could be a good example of it. So, this study is anchored on the rational choice theory. And take note of the year, the 1776. This is an example of a seminal work, an original work, okay, which avers that people choose options that maximizes their personal benefits. In a decision situation, a person asks, what will accrue to me if I take this option? The rational choice theory is one of the several choice theories that are currently entertained, including Pareto's choice theory, where a person chooses an option that improves the lot of a sector but does not make other sectors worse off, and the contingent choice theory, which is based on a person's valuation of the options. In the rational choice theory, the choice of an option depends on the perceived reward of that option but ignores the risks associated with that option. As long as an option provides the highest perceived reward, regardless of the amount of risks, the theory stipulates that a person will generally prefer that option. And then after that, you get to discuss your main variables and other variables that may be of interest in relation to the theory adopted. You may culminate with a discussion of the relationships and interrelationships of the variables. But notice that we have discussed the theory that is mainly used, for example, in this paper. So this paper has used the rational choice theory, has chosen to examine the rational choice theory. So therefore, in the conceptual framework, we get to see an explanation of that. Now let's give an example of some of the diagrams that you might see. So this is a very familiar way of presenting a diagram, like a conceptual framework diagram. Now, when you have a diagram, you don't just put the diagram and then that's it. You still have to explain the diagram. So in this case, for example, the study, as we could see, would be about customer satisfaction. So there are so many theories on customer satisfaction. Perhaps they wanted to use, for example, the service quality theory. And apparently, customer satisfaction is viewed from the point of food taste, the speed of service, and staff performance. So customer satisfaction is measured by those three variables. This could be another diagram that you might see. So if you would notice, hypothesis 1 would aver that the outsourcing motive positively impacts relationship interaction. That's hypothesis 1. Relationship interaction positively impacts relationship quality, which is measured according to the four variables. So notice that in this case, outsourcing motives is determined to be the independent variable, supplier-customer relations is considered to be the intervening variable, and the customer perceived value is the dependent variable. Essentially looking at whether outsourcing motives affect customer perceived values. Perhaps another common diagram that you would see in the conceptual framework section is the IPO, or the input process output diagram. So in the input process output, you basically outline to your readers what inputs you use. In this case, for example, looking at demographic profiles like gender, year level, type of social media being used, and then the process. What's the process? Administering questionnaires, tabulation of students' responses, and then statistical analysis. And then the output in this case will be the level of effectiveness using social media, for example, in the political literacy of college students. So in this particular diagram, the focus or the highlight, what you want to tell your readers, is essentially the process of your research, right? The input, the process, and the output of your research. Now, while commonly used personally, if you are looking into relationships, for example, this might not be this might not be a very emphatic way to present it. As you could see, it's not very clear if there's a relationship testing, but usually this is used if the study is more on the descriptive approach. Okay, so we have talked about the theories, we have talked about propositions, hypotheses, eventually what goes into your conceptual framework, and some examples of diagrams. But before we go to the actual writing of the CF, let's reinforce what we know about variables and relationships. So again, perhaps this might be a common diagram that you see. So in this case, we have hours of study being the independent variable and the dependent variable being exam scores. So perhaps the hypothesis here is that the higher or the more hours spent studying, the higher is the exam score. So notice that the independent variable is seen to drive or to influence the exam score, which is the dependent variable. So if you're using a quantitative approach, then it is very usual for your panelists to ask you, what is your independent variable and what is your dependent variable? You must be able to justify as well why this is chosen to be the independent, meaning to say the variable that affects, and then the dependent, meaning to say the variable that is affected by the independent variable. Now, you may also encounter what is called a moderator variable. Now, when you talk about a moderating variable, it's a variable that can strengthen or weaken an association between two variables. So, for example, in the case of hours of study to exam score, so the high or the more hours spent studying, the higher will be the exam score. But then the IQ of the student, okay, may actually either strengthen or worsen this relationship. Okay, so it doesn't mean that the hours of study will affect the IQ and the IQ will it will affect the exam score. That is not how it is read. We're basically saying the hours of study affects exam score, but then this will be either strengthened or worsened by the IQ of the respondent. So a moderating variable provides additional information, that's the key there, regarding the relationship of two variables in a quantitative research. So the moderator variable has the power to either strengthen, weaken, or even totally remove the relationship between the two variables, independent and dependent. Now, there can also be what is called a mediating variable. And a mediating variable is a variable that links the independent and dependent variables. So, unlike in the moderating variable, the moderator variable is not linked to the independent and dependent variables. It simply improves the existing relationship. But in a mediator variable, the mediator variable links the independent and dependent variables. In other words, if you think about it, hours of study to exam score is seen to have a direct path. So you expect there to be a direct relationship between hours of study and exam score. But then you have also observed an indirect path to exam score. The indirect path being from hours of study, your hours of study will affect the number of practice problems completed. And I think you will agree with me on this, right? If you only study for 10 minutes, that might likely mean just one case. But if you study for 1 hour, then you might be solving 6 cases. So the hours of study will affect the number of practice problems completed, and the number of practice problems completed will affect the respondent's exam score. So here we got to notice a direct path from hours of study to exam score and an indirect path from hours of study to number of practice problems to exam scores. So the mediating variable is present when a third variable influences the relationship between the predictor and the criterion variables, and it provides that link. Okay, so there is an indirect path. So we say it's not only the hours of study that will affect the exam score, the hours of study will affect the number of practice problems completed, which will eventually affect as well the exam score. So if we get to compare the two, the difference between a mediator and a moderator variable, so in the first diagram that we have here to your left, that's of course the moderator variable. So it simply strengthens, okay, it makes the relationship, there's already an existing relationship, it strengthens or weakens the existing relationship. The other diagram that you get to see at this time on your right is what we call the mediator variable. So somehow this got swapped around. So this is the mediator variable, and the mediator variable is one which provides the indirect path, okay, to your dependent variable. So if you are looking into relationships that may have the presence of a mediator variable, then it is quite likely that you might want to examine the path analysis, of these variables. Now, there is also what we call a control variable, and a control variable is a factor or an element that the researchers seek to keep constant when conducting a research. For example, initially we wanted to look at independent variable hours of study to the exam score, right? But would you also agree with me that the health of the examinee will also affect the exam score? So a relatively healthier examinee is expected to perform better than an examinee who is perhaps sick on the day of the exam. It affects the exam score. And so therefore, you wouldn't want this variable to muddle the results of your study. Okay, you wouldn't want it to provide unnecessary noise to your study. So what you do is you control the variable health. How do you control the health variable? Then you only study those who are physically healthy examinees. If the examinee is not feeling well during the time of the exam, then it will not be part of your pool of respondents. So that is how you control a variable. Okay, so this is a control variable, that which you desire to keep constant when conducting your research. Okay, so this is another example of a diagram, and usually when we see multifaceted relationships like this and multiple variables like this might be something you wish to explore by using maybe structural equation modeling, for example. Okay, now another diagram which you might encounter will be in relation to qualitative studies. Now, because qualitative studies do not have variables, we basically have dimensions or aspects. So our diagrams might look different from the usual quantitative studies. So for those of you who are doing quali, this might be a diagram that you're familiar with or that you might have encountered in your literature review. For example, perspectives, insights, and vision, concerns, desires, and grievances, challenges, and difficulties experienced. These are the three categories of dimensions that you would like to explore in relation to the lived experiences of medical health workers during community quarantine. Okay, so this might be how a quali paper diagram would look like. Another might be using, for example, the Delphi technique application requirements. So composition of panel size of experts, then gathering of the experts' opinions, then determining the level of consensus. Then if there is a consensus, then the statistical group responds. So again, this is an example used of a diagram in a qualitative study. Okay, so having seen those major components of a conceptual framework, it is now your turn. But before you write the conceptual framework, let's show first another example, very important illustration of converting the theories to propositions and hypotheses. Hopefully, this can help you better. So, for example, if the theory is the Herzberg's two-factor theory by Herzberg in 1959, so this is the reason why I would tell you that there can be some very dated, very old theories and literature, and you can still cite them, especially if they're the theory that you wish to use in your study. So in the case of Herzberg's two-factor theory, the theory is that it's also known as the motivation hygiene theory, or intrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. It concludes that there are certain factors in the workplace that can cause job satisfaction and a separate set of factors that can cause dissatisfaction. So from this theory, we can come up with a proposition. High level of job satisfaction is a good predictor of employee retention. And maybe your hypothesis might be that the higher the level of job satisfaction, the higher is the employee's intention to stay. Or the more motivated an employee is, the more loyal the employee becomes. So from theory to proposition to hypothesis. This time, let's try to convert our hypotheses to variables, and let's give an operational definition to our variables. So if the hypothesis, for example, is the higher the level of job satisfaction, the more likely an employee stays, our variables would of course be level of job satisfaction and intention to stay. Perhaps your operational definition might be we would measure job satisfaction by using a job satisfaction survey. So the scores on a job satisfaction survey becomes the operational definition of job satisfaction. Intention to stay, maybe you can have another survey on an employee's intention to stay. So because this is not the actual tenure, but the intention to stay. So you can have another survey for that. So the scores on an intention to stay survey. Another hypothesis that we presented as an illustration is the more motivated an employee is, the more loyal the employee becomes. Okay, so for this, our variables are level of motivation and employee loyalty. Our operational definition would be customer feedback and maybe tenure. Okay, so that is how we convert our theories to propositions, to hypotheses, to variables, and eventually to your operational definition. Now, needless to say, this is more fit and appropriate for those who are using a quantitative approach. For a more qualitative approach, and we would get to see more explanations and discussions on the dimensions and aspects that you will be utilizing in your study. So now it really is your turn. I hope you take the time to huddle with your team and try to come up with your conceptual framework. Remember, again, to start with a theory or more. Okay, it can be one or more theories. And then to talk about, this could also include the concepts or variables that you have read in your literature review. Please make sure that your conceptual framework is able to discuss the theory and to explain the relationships that you expect to find in your study. As an option, it is highly encouraged for you to come up with a conceptual framework diagram. Do not forget to label it as figure 1. So if you are presenting a diagram, present the diagram first. Perhaps you can introduce the diagram very quickly, present it first, and then followed by your explanation of the theory and the concepts and the variables that you intend to use. All right, so that's it for the conceptual framework. We will be having a separate discussion for the method section, or the methods that you can use in your research. But for now, you did a good job. I hope that you huddle with your team and have a productive discussion. Thank you so much for joining.